So actually, my talk is on literature and empathy, and if you have the more recent version of the program, it will say that. Certainly the high points of European literature are part of that story, and there's a couple remarks along the way about that. But I just wanted to open by saying I come here from southwestern Virginia. Charlottesville is just the town right over the mountains where we go to get Indian food and a university library. And the Washington and Lee that I come from is indeed it's that Lee. It's Robert E. Lee. He was the president at Washington and Lee after the Civil War ended until he died. He's buried on our campus. I work in a building that is he lived in for 3 years. So we live with these issues, and I want to say about our humanists that in the midst of the situation that we find ourselves, our humanists are especially important to us in articulating responses to the contemporary moment. Our historians of the American Civil War and Reconstruction period, our ethicists, our poets, our theater people, all of these people are extremely important to us. They are not, because the situation that we find ourselves in is not simply a civic crisis, but it is a historiographical argument about the meaning of those statues and memorials. It's an ethical conundrum about the clash in values where freedom of speech and assembly are important American foundational values, but so too is avoiding violent hate. It's a persuasive task, and that's especially relevant to those of us who teach young people, and it's an expressive mandate for artists. All of those things are going on, and those are things that humanists and artists are especially well poised to contribute to the discourse today, and I hope also the action. So I won't say any more about that, but if you're curious about what it's like in a place that 3 years ago had Confederate battle flags in its main room of assembly in Lee Chapel, where there's a statue of Lee recumbent in the place of where an altar would be, I would be happy to share those experiences. But thank you so much for the invitation to be here. And now I'm going to launch into my talk, which is actually about literature and empathy. So let me begin with 2 premises that ought not to be controversial. First, the humanities are not just for humanists. They are for all human beings and to some extent other living creatures. Second, empathy is one of the ways that embodied creatures, including non-human animals, experience and express their intersubjectivity. Because our focus is the contribution that the humanities make to the modern university, and because my topic is the much narrower subject of literature and empathy, I will set these 2 premises aside for a time, but you will have already discerned that labeling them as uncontroversial does not mean that we have come anywhere near realizing them in the real world. For a pragmatic statement of the state of affairs, we might do well to acknowledge that although the humanities are for all human beings and by extension to other living creatures, they are widely perceived as impractical or rarefied enclaves, areas of study that need not concern most students, most scholars, or even most citizens. And human empathy, part of the physiological, cognitive, and emotional makeup of all of us, is on the one hand an exalted quality to which we attribute all sorts of social goods, compassion and altruism, openness to alternative perspectives, and concern for others, and a subject of our deepest disappointments, as empathy persistently reveals itself to be short-lived, insufficiently productive of compassion or altruistic action, subject to limitation by distance, difference, and unfamiliarity, curtailed as it is by the here and now bias, the similarity bias, and the familiarity bias. Those are things that are studied by psychologists. Our perceptions of others' empathy, more rarely of our own, as false or failed, may renew our sense of how central the cultivation of empathy or the channeling of empathy into prosocial outcomes should be as a part of the project of university education. Or it may make us wary of making claims for the role of empathy, especially if we are expected to demonstrate to accreditors, that would be in the US context, or our governments, or our fellow citizens, that a humanistic university education increases both empathy and its presumed outcomes. An especially tempting conclusion to make, one that many deans and defenders of the humanities have echoed, is the argument that exposure to imaginative literature that evokes empathy for unreal beings will create or increase a reader's capacity for empathy for real humans. Now, I've spent the better part of the last 15 years skeptically examining the claim that novel reading leading to readers' empathy automatically leads to altruism in the real world. One of the useful qualities of training in the humanities turns out to be a habit of skeptical scrutiny. We humanists also believe in the process of argument, so I especially look forward to the exchange of views that we will have in the question period. In my time today, I plan to discuss the debates and challenges of the interdisciplinary research context for literary theories of narrative empathy, including readers' empathy, authors' strategic empathizing, and the relationship of empathy for textual creations to prosocial action in the real world. To do that, I will describe how literary empathy studies draws on research and theorizing in 3 distinct areas of psychology, cognitive, developmental, and social psychology, on philosophical work in ethics and moral philosophy, and on recent developments in neuroscience. So there's a lot of embedded footnotes in here that you're not going to hear, but if you're curious after, you can ask me and I'll give you the citation. But this report on scientific areas of research comes to you from the perspective of an empirically minded humanist. So the current scholarship and debates. Understanding empathy as an aspect of readers' responses to literature, authors' creative imagining, and the textual cues that invite or repel experiences of emotional fusion with literary texts has become a lively area of literary theorizing and empirical research. Drawing on existent research in 3 distinct areas of psychology, cognitive, developmental, and social psychology, on philosophical work in the areas of ethics and moral philosophy, and stimulated by the discovery of mirror neurons and the proposal that human beings possess a shared manifold for intersubjectivity with others, literary empathy studies has been an interdisciplinary endeavor from the outset. With roots in the German psychological aesthetics of the turn of the 20th century, in which context the term Einfühlung first emerged, studies of empathy have been carried out since then by psychologists, philosophers, art and literary critics, and in recent decades by neuroscientists, sometimes working in collaboration with humanists. That richness of approach brings with it immediate challenges, starting with the terminology used to label a wide variety of empathic phenomena, many of which correlate with experiences literary theorists associate with techniques, genres, and historical periods of literature. In a literary context, the novelist Vernon Lee and the poetry critic Richard Harter Vogel, Lee from 1913 and Vogel for 1949, adapted Einfühlung to the description of aesthetic acts and responses, but in subsequent decades, literary empathy has been more squarely associated with character identification, regarded as a version of the role-taking or perspective-taking imagination. Psychologist Daniel Batson's 2011 article, These Things Called Empathy, 8 Related but Distinct Phenomena, usefully elaborates and describes the qualities of components of empathy, including what others have studied under the labels of cognitive empathy and empathic accuracy, motor mimicry, emotional contagion, Einfühlung, theory of mind, perspective-taking, role-taking, putting oneself in the shoes of another, personal distress, and the older term sympathy. A limitation of Batson's list lies in his omission of fantasy empathy, involving empathic responsiveness to imaginary beings, including literary creations. My own definition of narrative empathy can be regarded as describing a variety of that missing piece of fantasy empathy. So in an online source which you can look at, the Living Handbook of Narratology, I offer this definition. Narrative empathy is the sharing of feeling and perspective-taking induced by reading, viewing, hearing, or imagining narratives of another's situation and condition. Narrative empathy plays a role in the aesthetics of production when authors experience it, in mental simulation during reading, in the aesthetics of reception when readers experience it, and in the narrative poetics of texts when formal strategies invite it. Narrative empathy overarches narratological categories involving actants, that's roughly speaking characters and things in story worlds. Actants, narrative situation, that's the stuff that involves point of view. Matters of pace and duration, and story world features such as settings. The diversity of the narratological concepts involved suggests that narrative empathy should not be simply equated with character identification, nor exclusively verified by readers' reports of identification. So character identification might invite narrative empathy. Alternatively, spontaneous empathy with a fictional character might precede character identification. Empathetic effects of narrative have been theorized by literary critics, philosophers, and psychologists, and they've been evaluated by means of experiments in discourse processing, empirical approaches to narrative impact, and through introspection. Empathy-evoking literary texts call upon readers' emotional responsiveness to textual creations or representations, and these readers' sensations of matching feelings possess an authenticity that may arise from the human neural capacity for shared intersubjectivity among real people. Writers hoping to evoke empathy reach out to different audiences through bounded, ambassadorial, and broadcast strategic empathy. They employ, and cognitive narratologists investigate, a wide variety of techniques to invite readers' empathy. Yet real-life empathy is subject to diminishment or even elimination from interfering biases. The here and now bias, which is the tendency to favor those near us in time and place over those far away. Similarity or familiarity bias, enabling humans to connect more readily to those like ourselves or already known to us, and less well with those outside our groups or experiences. Whether the real-life empathy that human beings feel for living others works the same way and with the same limitations and benefits in literary empathy is a fundamental debate in empathy studies, including those carried out by scientists. Indeed, some of the most provocative and widely publicized findings about the impact of literary reading on the empathic abilities of readers have resulted from psychological research by cognitive scientists. So you may have seen David Kidd and Emmanuel Castano's study showing that theory of mind improves as a result of reading literary but not popular fiction. I have a lot of problems with that study, which we could talk about if you're interested. Humanists are not invariably convinced by the reasoning implicit in scientific studies, however, and empathy itself has its critics. For example, as philosopher Jesse Prinz suggests, empathy roused for one individual or group sometimes leads to unjust responses regarded from a utilitarian point of view, or may be employed in a two-step process where empathy for an in-group then paves the way for antipathy or even murderous dehumanization of an out-group. Among literary critics, post-colonial literary theorists in particular critique assumptions of biologically based universal human emotions that erase differences, so they have a different kind of problem with the idea of empathy. Bearing on this question are several other areas of controversy. They include the philosophical debates about the status of fictional emotions, known as the paradox of fictional emotions in philosophy, the attribution of enhanced effectiveness to artful literary fiction as opposed to what most people read most of the time, and the contention that narrative empathy leads to altruism, prosocial actions, and good world citizenship, and the argument that all forms of empathy, including literary empathy, are inefficacious when false empathy, failed empathy, and personal distress, which is a kind of empathic reaction that causes you to push away from the thing that's causing the feeling, when those things intervene, and the implications of gender and other aspects of readers' intersectional identities for reception of strategic narrative empathizing on the part of authors. Cross-disciplinary stress points in empathy studies whose interdisciplinarity involves empirical research in scientific disciplines or collaboration between and among humanists, social scientists, and natural scientists underlie many, if not all, of these debates. And not a single thing I named in that paragraph of problem areas has really been resolved. Before the neuroscience of mirror neurons emerged, late 20th century psychology had already recognized that human beings can and do feel with fictional characters in a way that resembles human empathy with real others. Batson's omission of fantasy empathy from his taxonomy of empathic phenomena should be regarded as an oversight, not an indication of lack of interest on the part of psychologists in general in narrative empathy. Indeed, some developmental and social psychological theories of empathy, I'm thinking of Martin Hoffman, show the influence of ideas about the novel as a school for the sentiments and morality of readers. One subscale of social psychologist Mark Davis's widely adopted interpersonality reactivity responsiveness test, or the IRI, measures subjects' fantasy empathy, which in Davis's words taps respondents' tendencies to transpose themselves imaginatively into the feelings and actions of fictitious characters in books, movies, and plays. Keith Oatley, a cognitive psychologist and novelist, led the way in the study of emotions involved in literary response, including character identification, and developed a robust psychology of fiction. Ed Tan of Amsterdam, Frank Hockemoulder of Utrecht, and their collaborators have been studying aspects of affect induced by film, fiction, and other media for decades. Some of this research aims at understanding how literature in a variety of media draws on human emotions to induce affects, while other studies investigate the effects of empathic reading or viewing experiences on a subject's subsequent emotional state, reflectiveness, and behavior. Media psychologists Melanie Green, Jeffrey Strange, David Brock, and their collaborators have studied the immersive reading referred to by the term transportation, a phenomenon that often involves experiences of empathy. This is the feeling of being lost in a book. David S. Mile, working in collaboration with Don Kuiken, a social and cultural psychologist, developed a sophisticated research program studying the neuroaesthetics of literary reading, including empathy and emotional engagement in a discourse processing context. One outcome of the efforts mentioned here, the writing of introductory guides to empirical methodologies for humanists by Sonia Zinger, Marisa Bortolucci, Willie Van Peer, Peter Dixon, and again Hockemoulder, proves useful to empathy scholars in literary studies. A second outcome is the expansion of interdisciplinary journals in which to read about empathy from a variety of angles, as in the 2012 special section on empathy in Emotion Review. Research about literary empathy can be found in journals such as the Scientific Study of Literature, which is a publication of the Society, the International Society for the Empirical Study of Literature and Media, or IGEL, Empirical Studies of the Arts, Emotion Review, as well as in literary journals with an interest in cognitive poetics, such as the Journal of Literary Theory, Narrative, Poetics, and Poetics Today. However, the incorporation and analysis of data from empirical studies sometimes meets with resistance from humanists, especially in response to credulous, exaggerated, or inaccurate reporting of neuroscience research on empathy by non-neuroscientists. To address that concern, literary scholars and other humanists should take secondhand reports in the popular press with a grain of salt and should make every effort to read the original papers, to examine their methodology, including the constitution of the pool of research subjects, and to pay attention to the size of the effects measured. Though papers with iconic brain images, especially the colorful ones, may exert undue influence, this has actually been demonstrated that people sort of suspend their critical faculties when they see colorful brain images, and neuroscientific explanations may sway some readers through what is called the seductive allure of that field. These effects are surely counteracted by many humanists' preset judgment that neuroscience is inevitably reductive and essentializing. That dismissive position may prevent serious discussion of the results of exemplary collaborations whose findings deserve attention. Ideally, critical evaluation of neuroscientific investigations of literary reading would and should flow in both directions. Some of the backlash against what is sometimes characterized as a misguided or wrong kind of interdisciplinarity arises when speculative theorizing of evolutionary biologists and psychologists gets applied to literary studies as if genres, styles, and literary techniques were subject to natural selection. There too, literary scholars should engage with these theories with the skepticism and close reading skills that are the hallmarks of literary critical training. Marco Juven's 2014 critique of literary Darwinism is exemplary in this regard. However, some of the negative response to empirical study of empathy as it bears on literary studies comes from humanists' characterization of psychologists, biologists, and neuroscientists and cognitive scientists as engaging in universalizing descriptions of human nature that virtually all anthropologists, historians, and literary critics trained in the scrutiny of difference would reject out of hand. Perhaps the most compelling version of this critique comes from Ralph Savarese, whose call for a neurocosmopolitanism warns against regarding neurotypical experience as a default version of human experience. Savarese's cautions were instigated by the medical diagnostic manuals that include an empathy deficit as a quality of autism and Asperger's syndrome. Savarese suggests, and recent research supports, that an excess of empathy verging on personal distress rather than a lack of empathy may in fact be discovered to be the experience of autistic subjects if one takes the trouble to ask them. While it is certainly true that the psychological sciences emphasize empirical evidence to understand how the brain and body participate in human and animal behavior, these disciplines also recognize that subjects' responses distribute across ranges, revealing more and less typical possibilities. So while excellent work has been done to develop understanding of the underlying physical mechanisms and neural substrate of empathy, neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, and psychologists expect variation in both physiological empathic responses, the kind that you can measure from heart rate and palm sweat, as well as from suggestive brain images of blood flow in key brain areas, as well as in the conscious experience of research subjects as elicited by querying them or observing them in an experimental setting. Since an individual person's experience of empathy, real or literary, requires both human cognition and affect, the burgeoning knowledge about how thinking and feeling interact in our responses to real and imagined others should be pertinent to theorizing about empathy. It certainly does not follow that all differences among people, differences that stem from our highly variant intersectional identities and experiences, should be erased just because psychological, neuroscientific, and cognitive studies inform the discussion. An awareness of findings about empathy emerging from empirical disciplines enriches current theorizing about literary empathy. Now, the career of literary empathy reaches back at least to the 18th century, where many of the phenomena described by Batson were theorized by Adam Smith and David Hume under the term sympathy. In keeping with later parsing of the distinctive phenomena of empathy out of sympathy, I differentiate narrative empathy from sympathy actually quite differently than we heard in the first talk, by defining the former as a version of the same feeling. When Dorothea Brooke feels trapped and frustrated by her marriage to Casaubon, I feel trapped and frustrated, empathy, but my feeling of pity for her deluded and impotent husband is sympathy, because I don't share the beliefs and feelings of Casaubon. I'm feeling an appropriate emotional response to his condition that's not empathic, it's sympathetic, whereas my response to her is truly empathetic. Both Smith and Hume, whose descriptions of sympathy include illustrations that we would identify as either affective or cognitive forms of empathy, such as motor mimicry, emotional contagion, role-taking, and perspective-taking, were read with care by literary authors. The English poetry, drama, and fiction of the 18th and 19th centuries reveals an interest on the part of these authors in evoking shared feelings, whether in the sensationalist invitations of Gothic, offering thrills and chills, or in the more sober education of the sympathetic imagination that George Eliot theorized and implemented in her novels. The novel of sentiment, a genre that enjoyed popularity during a period of social change, has been understood as a school for the emotions. In Empathy in the Novel, I argued that the argument between moral sentimentalists and their critics about the efficacy of literary empathy as a spur to morality or a waste of the feelings on non-existent beings and a moral dead end has been restaged many times since the 18th century. Some of the points in that debate still inform research in empathy studies today. However, before tackling what experiencing narrative empathy might result in for those who feel it, a more fundamental philosophical debate about the status of fictional emotions should be considered. And since there's a room full of philosophers out there, I'll just say I'm just sketching. Philosophers debate the emotions evoked by reading, viewing, or hearing fictional narrative under the phrase, the paradox of fictional emotions, in a fashion that is directly relevant to empathy studies. The debate centers on whether it is possible to feel genuine emotion in response to a fictitious character or event. Even when, and possibly because, readers are aware of the fictionality of a text, they feel for and with characters and get involved in the narrated events, in part responding to the core affects of narrativity, which is curiosity, suspense, and surprise. Why do readers who know that a work is fictional experience emotions that they regard as real? Three propositions by philosopher Robert Yanal summarize this paradox set. First, some people, I'm quoting him now, some people, will call them emoters, on occasion experience emotions towards characters or situations they take to be fictions. Second, any person experiences an emotion only if he believes that the object of his emotions both exists and exhibits at least some of the emotion-inducing properties specific to that emotion. Third, no emoter who takes the object of his emotion to be fiction believes that the object of the emotion exists and exhibits any emotion-inducing properties. Yanal explains this paradox, writing, "We thus have, yet cannot have, emotions towards fiction. Since narrative empathy depends upon the sensation of shared feeling or emotional fusion, somehow the fictions that evoke it transcend, albeit temporarily, the barriers of non-existence and illogic. Need non-existence pose a problem, though? Samuel Johnson observed in 1765 that imitations produce pain or pleasure, not because they are mistaken for realities, but because they bring realities to mind." Writing about the emotional impact of drama in this case, Johnson suggested, "The reflection that strikes the heart is not that the evils before us are real evils, but that they are evils to which we ourselves may be exposed. If there be any fallacy, it is not that we fancy the players, the actors, but that we fancy ourselves unhappy for a moment. The delight of tragedy proceeds from our consciousness of fiction. If we thought murders and treasons real, they would please no more." Theorists of fictional emotions offer alternatives to Colin Radford's irrationality charge in the form of what's called make-believe theory, counterpart theory, and thought theory. Kendall Walden argues that readers and viewers are not irrational, they're playing a game of make-believe. But the feelings fiction evokes are for Walton only quasi-emotions, not the real emotions referred to in Yanal's first proposition, but make-believe feelings elicited in a game involving pretend play. Counterpart theory offers a different workaround of the irrationality charge. It acknowledges the existence of possible worlds, but requires that people exist in only one world. Their responses to fictional persons in secondary worlds are understood as caused by making analogies to the situations of actual people. The fictional beings, by this argument, cause the reader or viewer to think about real beings that share their real world. Cognitive theories of empathy, especially those emphasizing perspective-taking and role-taking imagining, can be seen as compatible with the restrictions of counterpart theory. The quick, seemingly involuntary emotional experiences of narrative empathy that occur during reading or viewing literary texts are more difficult to explain by make-believe or counterpart theories, however. Philosophical thought theorists argue that thoughts without belief in the actuality of fictional beings can still evoke emotional responses from readers, accounting for Yanal's second proposition and supporting his third contention that no emoter who takes the object of his emotion to be fiction believes that the object of the emotion exists and exhibits any emotion-inducing properties. This avoidance of the irrationality charge doesn't interfere with the reader or viewer's feelings, which may, after all, be involuntary. Psychologists Richard Garrick and David Rapp provide in their research on the mechanisms of narrative impact support for thought theory. They confute make-believe theory, tackling at its source in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, which is from 1817. In contrast to Coleridge's famous view that readers must willingly suspend disbelief to procure poetic faith in fictions, these shadows of imagination, Coleridge calls them, Gehrig and Rapp argue that readers must effortfully and actively work to disbelieve the reality of fictive narratives. To them, our default state is gullible, not skeptical. Readers ordinarily receive narrative information as continuous with information gleaned from real experience. We have to exert ourselves consciously to think of fictional narratives as fictional, especially while we are experiencing them, says Gehrig. The metaleptic gestures of metafiction, breaking the frame and reminding readers of a text's fictionality, plays with this habit of readers. Media psychologist Ed Tan has shown that movie viewers may experience the same emotional responses as witnesses, regardless of fictionality, in research that backs up thought theory. So the status of fictional emotions debate intersects in empathy studies with controversies about theory of mind, a branch of cognitive science that's informed by philosophies of mind. With regards to empathy, philosophers, cognitive scientists, and psychologists still debate whether theory or simulation theory provides the most persuasive account of how humans share and understand the mental states and emotions of others through mind reading. And mind reading does not mean mind reading like in fiction. It just means making a very good, pretty accurate guess of what's going on in the mind of another person. Theory holds that human subjects develop as children theories about how and why others behave the way they do. They apply these folk psychological beliefs, which they've developed through observation as they mature cognitively, to their interpretations of others' behaviors. Theory can accommodate some innate responses, but it emphasizes the formation, testing, and revision of theories as part of a cognitive process, including theories of others' minds. Simulation theory suggests that human beings simulate, through mental modeling, others' experiences in order to arrive at an understanding of their thoughts and feelings. This process can happen very rapidly, as in reading facial expressions, and without conscious exertion. The validity of simulation theory has received a boost from the discovery of mirror neurons, which in turn suggests the existence of a physiological mechanism for a shared manifold for intersubjectivity. Simulation theory places empathic behavior, Einfühlung, at the center of its processes, leading either to role-taking or perspective-taking. Though each of these schools of thought, simulation theory and theory, represents groups of theories, some of whose adherents vehemently denounce interpretations from the other side, common sense suggests that an individual subject's empathy may be partly driven by automatic mental simulations and supported by folk theories or ideas derived by observation about how others behave. In other words, we actually don't have to choose. We can have it both ways. Indeed, as philosopher of science Massimo Moraffo points out, a consensus seems to be emerging that mind reading involves both theory and simulation theory, but I will warn you, those are fighting words amongst the philosophers. When it comes to literary empathy, the dispositions of both authors and readers have a bearing on the way the other minds of represented persons are constructed and received. Aspects of authors' and readers' intersectional identities, especially gender, have been hypothesized to play a significant role in co-creating experiences of narrative empathy. Psychologist Marjorie Taylor suggests a relationship between high empathizing individuals and successful fiction writing in a study of the illusion of independent agency, which is the sense authors have that their fictional characters have taken on lives of their own and are exerting control over what happens to them, controlling the author. Other studies have emphasized the empathic abilities and social advantages that fiction readers have over consumers of nonfiction. It seems clear that possessing the trait of empathizing predisposes people to enjoyment of fiction, and in the much smaller subset of people who become authors, to create characters in fictional worlds that invite immersive reading experiences. However, these studies of empathy in fiction reading also contribute to the theory that novel reading helps not only to exercise readers' empathy, but to cultivate it and develop what Martha Nussbaum describes as good world citizenship, or what Steven Pinker regards as a nicer, more peaceable, or at least less murderous human species. I respond at length to the moral sentimentalist hypothesis that novel reading develops readers' sympathetic imagination and empathy in the novel, questioning the degree to which the empathy altruism hypothesis also pertains to readers' subsequent behavior after experiences of narrative empathy. Many readers experience fictional emotions intensely, remembering them for years in some cases, and seeking out their repetition through more reading and viewing. Narrative empathy certainly fuels a fiction consumption habit. My reading of the developmental psychology of personality convinces me that fiction reading alone is unlikely permanently to shift a reader's disposition at the level of the big 5 personality traits, but it's certainly demonstrable that experiences of narrative empathy can change attitudes about outgroups, reduce bias, and translate into real-world sympathy for others outside of books. The link between narrative empathy and altruism or prosocial action is still more tenuous, though psychologist Dan R. Johnson has demonstrated at least short-term increases in both empathy and prosocial helping behavior as a result of immersive reading primed by mental visualizing exercises. So in other words, it's good to get lost in a book. Altruism is in itself a controversial subject in evolutionary biology, psychology, and philosophy, and whether or not it is reliably inspired by empathic feelings induced by literary works is only the first problem. Narrative empathy, like its real-world counterpart, has been criticized for evoking mistaken, false empathy that misgauges the feeling of the other, or inefficacious, failed empathy that simply stalls out, sometimes as a result of the overly intense aversive response known as personal distress. When narrative empathy does stimulate emotion fusion, no moral guarantees exist. Literary works can set about to arouse empathy for morally suspect subjects, such as white supremacists, and if action arises from such emotion, it can be antisocial or even an instance of what has been described as pathological altruism. The mechanisms employed in literary text to evoke the emotional fusion and even physiological responses characteristic of narrative empathy can be bent to amoral or vicious ends as readily as to the laudable projects of civic virtue. In my own opinion, understanding how narrative empathy works outside a value-laden expectation that it ought to be morally improving leads to a better understanding of both empathy and narrative techniques. Narratives evoking empathy may be non-fictional or fictional. Readers, listeners, and viewers have the capacity to immerse themselves in, lose themselves in, feel transported into both fictional worlds where they experience emotions more appropriate to the situations or circumstances of imaginary denizens of those worlds than to themselves, and non-fictional accounts where, at least hypothetically, for factual narratives of the present day, they might cross-check their empathic accuracy with real people or corroborating sources. Empathy, sympathy, and affects related to the experience of literature have been theorized for over a century. For example, narrativity's core affects, inhering in the temporal asymmetries of story and discourse, have been identified as curiosity, surprise, and suspense. Metrical verse has been related to breathing and walking, with attributed physiological effects on heart rate and blood pressure. Immersion reading has been linked not only to the phenomenon of feeling lost in a book, but also to both positive and negative effects on the morality of readers. Immersed readers have more commonly been understood as indulging in deleterious escapism, but recently narrative immersion or transportation has been positively associated with improved empathy and prosocial behavior, as I've just described. From the opposite direction, working against empathy, Bertolt Brecht famously advocated that dramatic art should seek not an empathic response as a result of illusionary theater, but should instead seek an impact of estrangement, Verbremsung effect, sometimes rendered as alienation effect. Within the theories concerning each major mode of literature, including emergent transmedial or hybrid forms such as graphic narratives or hypertext fictions, one finds assumptions about the cognitive demands and affective impacts on readers. As I've suggested, the empirical study of these contentions or assumptions is still in its very early stages. Illuminating work has been accomplished in fine-grained neuroscientific or psychonarratological studies of the impact of particular narrative techniques, such as free and direct discourse, on aspects of narrative impact. The most difficult sorts of study to carry out are large ones, with thousands of participants, and long ones, measuring effects over time. The benefit of large studies, for example, involving thousands of college-age students as they enter and leave university, would be the ability to verify the lofty ambitions often expressed in the student learning outcomes associated with literary studies or diversity requirements or even the study of the humanities. These wished-for outcomes often include improved perspective taking and increased empathy. As it is, educators often undertake large-scale shifts in curricular recommendations speculatively. The benefit of longitudinal studies would be to understand better how reading habits inform life choices and even health outcomes over the lifespan. If literary experience of empathy do contribute to the development of civic virtues, longitudinal studies that remove confounding elements of education, experience, and identity would go a long way towards convincing the skeptical, among whom I number. I hope that it's become clear during this lecture that I believe both in the two-way traffic of ideas between the humanities and the natural sciences, and in the role that interdisciplinary conversation plays in advancing knowledge. A commitment to skeptical scrutiny of evidence carefully gathered should not divide us. Humanists can learn from social scientists and scientists about experimental design, and that can help us avoid making exaggerated claims that end up looking more like expressions of faith than like new knowledge. Scientists and social scientists with an interest in empathy benefit from the fine-grained appreciation of and understanding of the complexity of artworks and aesthetic responses that literary scholars and narrative theorists and, of course, art historians possess. Collaboration across and among the disciplines is the way forward. So almost 15 years ago, I went into my university's library searching for 1 or 2 books or papers on empathy as an aspect of reading, simply intending to write a footnote that acknowledged what we in literary studies have taken for granted ever since George Eliot set about to cultivate the reader's sympathetic imagination. Not only could I not find what I was seeking, but I found a cacophony of conflicting views and vocabularies in neighboring disciplines of philosophy, psychology, ethics, and aesthetics. Before I could move forward, I had to open my mind to the methods and questions of other disciplines, including developmental social psychology and neuroscience. Striving to understand and to communicate with others in disciplines far from my own home base as a narrative theorist and specialist in the English novel tested the merits of my humanities education. The process has convinced me that the way forward for the humanities lies in engagement and collaboration, not in defending the barricades. This depends on believing in the merit of what we have to share, the value of the questions we seek to answer, the beauty of the objects that we strive to understand, and not least in the process of handing on understanding and wisdom to the next generation of learners. That they will find new answers and questions, appreciate alien aesthetics, and emphasize different knowledge in their scholarship and teaching goes without saying. Perhaps the greatest challenges to empathy arise when we face the drastic changes that alter people's lives over time. How can we begin to imagine the feelings and experiences that our children's children will have on this threatened planet? When the conclusions of science boggle the mind, fiction enters in to make worlds in which we can traverse barriers and feel our way towards understanding. The arts and humanities earn their keep in universities and in societies because they are not just the guardians, but they are also the forge of culture. Thanks.